take the box?
Yeah, but everything is stale.
For real?
Yeah,
It's bad?
no, stale. Means like it's hard.
Wow.
Yeah,
And it's not edible, you think?
no. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد سيد المرسلين وخاتم النبيين، وعلى آله وأصحابه الطيبين الطاهرين، ومن اتبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له، ولا شبيه ولا مثيل له، ولا ضد ولا ند ولا جسد ولا صورة ولا أعضاء له. كان الله ولا مكان، فهو الآن على ما عليه كان. فلا تضربوا لله الأمثال، ولله المثل الأعلى. تنزه ربي عن الجلوس والقعود، وعن الحركة والسكون، وعن الاتصال والانفصال. لا يحل فيه شيء، ولا ينحل منه شيء، ولا يحل هو في شيء، لأنه ليس كمثله شيء. مهما تصورت بذلك فالله لا يشبه ذلك. ومن وصف الله بمعنى من معاني البشر فقد كفر. وأشهد أن سيدنا وعظيمنا وقائدنا وقرة أعيننا محمدا عبد الله ورسوله، ونبيه وصفيه وحبيبه وخليله، أرسله الله هدى ورحمة للعالمين، هاديا ومبشرا ونذيرا، وداعيا إلى الله بإذنه سراجا وهاجا وقمرا منيرا. اللهم صل وسلم وأعظم وأنعم وأكرم على هذا النبي الكريم كلما ذكره الذاكرون وغفل عن ذكره الغافلون. الصلاة والسلام عليك يا سيدي يا رسول الله، الصلاة والسلام عليك يا سيدي يا حبيب الله، الصلاة والسلام عليك يا سيدي يا عظيم الجاه. I praise Allah, I glorify Him and I thank Him for all the blessings that He gives without Him being obligated to give anything. And I ask Allah Ta'ala to raise the rank of our beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam and to protect his Muslim nation. I testify that no one deserves to be worshipped except Allah Ta'ala, the one without a partner, the one without an equal, the one without a similar. the one who is unlike anything in the universe, and nothing in the universe is like him. He has no father, no mother, no sister, no brother, no son, and no daughter. He exists without time and place because he is the creator of time and place. He does not reside above the throne like the Christians say, and he is not attributed with fatigue like the Jews say. Our Lord is glorified beyond any imperfection that the non-Muslims attribute to him. Whatever you imagine in your mind, Allah Ta'ala does not resemble that. And whoever attributes an attribute of the creations to Allah is not a Muslim. And I testify that Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, the son of Abdullah, the son of Abdul Muttalib, the son of Hashim, the son of Abdul Manaf, from the tribe of Quraysh, is the best creation of Allah and his final prophet and messenger, sent to all humans and jinn, and he is truthful about everything that he conveyed of the revelation. Thereafter, we remind ourselves to have the sincere intention for the sake of Allah in attending this session of Islamic knowledge. Because having the sincere intention is a requirement to get the reward. So the Muslim, whenever he does a good deed, he has to have the sincere intention for the sake of Allah to get reward for that good deed. The reward is defined as the compensation that the Muslim receives in the hereafter for the good deeds that he did in this life among what makes him happy. An example of the reward that is guaranteed to the righteous Muslim in the grave is that his grave is expanded approximately 105 feet by 105 feet, and his grave is illuminated with a light similar to the light of the full moon, and the fragrance of paradise will be present in the grave. The sincere intention means for the Muslim to do the good deed, seeking the acceptance of Allah only, and not the praise of the people. So alhamdulillah, we have reached to page 62 in the book, The Lucid Word. My copy, which is the first edition, the spot in the text where we're going to continue is the last paragraph on page 62. And it begins by the author saying, "It is obligatory upon every pubescent, sane, pure, not during menses or postpartum bleeding Muslim." So we're going to start from there. Last week we started talking about the purification and the prayers, and we finished talking about the prayer times. We mentioned how each prayer begins and ends, how the 5 daily prayers begin and end. Now we're going to move on to a different case, and you're going to move on to a case related to the prayers. The author said, "It is obligatory upon every pubescent, sane, pure," and what is meant by pure is not during menses or postpartum bleeding Muslim, to learn the times of these prayers and to perform these prayers in their prescribed times. So, if someone is pubescent, sane, and not on their menses, not on their period, and not on their nifas, the postpartum bleeding, the Muslim who is pubescent, sane, pure, not on their period or postpartum bleeding, they have to learn, they're obligated to learn these prayers, the times of these prayers, how they enter and how they exit. And they're obligated personally to perform these prayers in their prescribed times. Hence, prayer is not incumbent on the impubescent, the insane, and the original non-Muslim. The original non-Muslim is not obligated to pray in the sense that we do not compel them to pray while being a Catholic. So, page 62. So, explaining this, prayer is not incumbent means that the prayer would not be obligatory on the impubescent. So, if somebody was not pubescent, if somebody was under 15 lunar years of age, or they have not seen, or their mani has not exited, and for the girl she's not gotten her period, they're still prepubescent. They still have not been Islamically judged as not a child anymore. So if they're not pubescent, that means they're not accountable. That means that they are not obligated personally. So if a prepubescent child, if they were to leave out the prayers, if they didn't pray any of the prayers, they wouldn't get any sin on them, because as long as someone is not pubescent, they're not obligated with obligations. However, as we'll talk about in the later chapters, we're going to mention that it's an obligation upon the guardians of the prepubescent children who are mumayyiz, and we'll explain what that is, and have reached the age of 7 lunar years. Their guardians are obligated personally, or their guardians are obligated communally to order those prepubescent children to pray. But that doesn't mean that if the prepubescent child doesn't pray that they get a sin. So if someone's not pubescent, they're not obligated to pray. Also, the person who's insane, they're not obligated to pray either, because they don't have the faculty of the mind, therefore they're not accountable. And the original non-Muslim. So this case requires some important details. When the scholars of Islamic law, when they talk about the original non-Muslim, and they say that it is not incumbent on him to pray, they mean while that person remains in the state of original blasphemy, we don't compel them to do the prayer before they become Muslim. Although the case is that if that original non-Muslim is accountable and dies without embracing Islam, in the hereafter he will be judged for not becoming Muslim and praying, for not becoming Muslim and not fasting, for not becoming Muslim and doing the other obligations that we're obligated to do. So when it comes to the obligations that we have, they have prioritization. They have levels. The first obligation, the greatest obligation, the most important obligation is to be Muslim. Once the person is Muslim, now they are able, now they are qualified, now they are eligible to do the rest of the obligations. So once the person is Muslim, now they can do the prayer and it will be valid. Now they can do the fasting and it will be valid. Now they can pay zakah and it will be valid. Now they can go to the hajj and it will be valid. Now they can give charity and get reward for that. But while a person is in a state of being a non-Muslim, while a person is not a Muslim, if they were to do a good deed, it's not counted for them. If they were to do something that, let's say, the image of something that the Muslim is obligated to do, it would not be valid, it would not be counted. So that's what the scholars mean when they say that the original non-Muslim, it's not incumbent upon him to pray. Now, what does an original non-Muslim mean? This means someone who they were born to non-Muslim parents. So the way that a person is judged when they are born into this world, anybody who's born into this world, what they have in their heart is nothing. They don't have anything. It's mentioned in the Quran that when a person is born, they don't know anything. When a person is a baby, they don't know anything. They don't even, sometimes up to a certain point in their life, they don't even realize that they have limbs, that they have hands. So when a person is born, their hearts, they don't have anything in their hearts. They don't know anything. Then as that person grows, what happens? He becomes indoctrinated by his parents. But the judgment of that person when they're born, they get judged by affiliation to what their parents are. So if somebody's born to Christian parents, just by being born to Christian parents, that baby would be treated like a Christian if they were to die. In what sense? In the sense that, for example, that baby would not be allowed to bury that baby in a Muslim cemetery, a cemetery that's specifically for Muslims. But that baby, if they die while being a baby, they will go to paradise. They're not going to be judged on Judgment Day because they're just a baby. They haven't done anything. They're not accountable. Now as that baby grows, his parents, what are they going to do? They're going to expose him to whatever religion that they are, whether it's Christianity or Judaism or fire worship or whatever. And that baby, as an effect of the environment around him, will most likely, usually the case is, that that baby will be indoctrinated, that baby will follow what he has been exposed to. So as that baby grows, it becomes mumayyiz, which means mental discrimination, and that baby begins to, or that child begins to understand, and the child will grow and grow and grow until the child becomes pubescent. Then this person becomes pubescent. If they become accountable, if they hear the basic message of Islam, and after that, after they're sane and pubescent, now what they have to do immediately is become Muslim. But they're still called an original non-Muslim, meaning that from when they were born, they were judged by affiliation to their parents as whatever their parents are. And this is the meaning of what the Prophet ﷺ mentioned, that every person is born upon the fitrah, and this means the readiness to accept whatever is given to them. So if their parents were Christian, that child is most likely going to become indoctrinated into Christianity. If the parents of that child were Jews, then most likely that child is going to be indoctrinated into Judaism. And same thing for Islam. That child, if it's exposed to Islam, and it will most likely be indoctrinated into Islam. That hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, it does not mean that every person is born Muslim and then his parents change him. It does not mean that. Why? Because it's mentioned in the Quran that when we're born, we don't know anything. And so the meaning of the hadith is that each person is born upon a state in which they're ready to accept whatever they are filled with. And so if the person is filled with Christianity, he'll most likely go by that. If he's filled with Judaism, he'll most likely go by that, etc. So this original non-Muslim, even though they are not, while they're in that state, even though we don't tell them, while they're an accountable Christian, for example, we don't tell them, come stand with us in the prayer line and pray. Even though that's the case, if that accountable non-Muslim, when they die, if they have not embraced Islam, in the hereafter they will be judged and punished for not becoming Muslim and then doing the obligations. So just because someone is an original non-Muslim, this does not entail that they don't have to do the obligations, because the accountable people, they have to do the obligations. It's just a matter of, if a person is accountable and they're not Muslim, the first obligation that they need to do is become Muslim. And then after that, the next obligation they need to do is pray and abide by the rules of Islam. The author said, it is unlawful to perform these prayers ahead of their prescribed times or to delay them after their prescribed times without an excuse. Hence, if anyone prays ahead of the prayer time without an excuse, they bear a sin, and their prayer is not valid. They also bear a sin if they delay the prayer until after its time passes, but their prayer is valid. On the other hand, if the delay was for an excuse, such as traveling and the like, then it is not sinful. So, the default judgment, the original judgment, is that within these prayer times, the accountable Muslim is obligated to make sure that he fulfills that obligation in that window of time. So since the rule, since what Allah Ta'ala revealed to the Prophet ﷺ is this specific thing, then that's what we have to follow. So no one can take it upon themselves and say, well, I have to, for example, catch this flight, or I have to make this meeting and it's 5 minutes before the prayer time starts, I'm just going to go ahead and do the prayer and then go about my business. This would not be valid. Why? Because the one who judged and the one who decreed and the one who made it an obligation upon us, Allah Ta'ala, He made an obligation upon us to do it this way, to fulfill the obligation in this way. So if we do something different, it would not be valid. That's the simplified version of that. Is that Allah Ta'ala, He ordered us to do the obligation in this way. So if somebody tried to do it in a different way, it would not be valid. So that's why the author said, if anybody does these prayers before their actual time, then the prayer will be valid. Why? Simply because Allah Ta'ala ordered us to do them within these times. That's why. So that's why the person, it's important for them to learn the times so that they can make sure they are obeying Allah as Allah ordered them. So that they can make sure that they are fulfilling the obligation in the way that Allah Ta'ala made an obligation. So that's the first case. Before the prayer time, if the person does it without an excuse, their prayer is not valid. So it doesn't count as if they fulfill the obligation, and they get a sin for doing that. They get a sin for doing the prayer before its time. The second case is if a person, they do the prayer after the time is over. Now in this case there's a difference, a slight difference, a small difference. That small difference is that the person gets a sin for delaying the prayer without an excuse, but if they do end up doing the prayer, even if it's after its time, the prayer is considered that they did it. It's considered that they fulfilled it. So on Judgment Day, they won't be asked, why didn't you pray? For example, that's considered prayer. Now, what is an excuse? When we say an excuse, in the context of speaking about the Islamic law, it's referring to a religious excuse. It's referring to something that within the religion itself, Allah Ta'ala judged that you can do this. It's an exception. It's an excuse. It's something that would make this a rare scenario or make this not normal scenario valid. So the example that they give here is traveling. And this is a common example, something that most Muslims experience. Within the context of the religious rules, there's a certain scenario where if a Muslim travels in a certain way and a certain distance, then he is allowed religiously to do a prayer ahead of its time. And this is also with specific restrictions and conditions. He can do the prayer before the time of it starts, or he can delay that prayer to after its time. And so in the case of traveling, this is specific to the Dhuhr and the Asr, and the Maghrib and the Isha. So if a person is traveling Islamically, he is allowed to pray Dhuhr during its time, and he can bring forward the Asr prayer and pray Asr before the Asr time starts while it's in the lower time, with specific conditions, which are easy to follow. Or he has the choice of delaying Dhuhr to the Asr time. But in any case, he has to, if he delays it, he has to make sure that he does both of those prayers before Asr is over. It's not like an unrestricted delay that he can delay as much as he wants. And the same thing for Maghrib and Isha. And so this combining or bringing forward and delaying of the prayers is an excuse for the traveler in the specific way, and only for those prayers. Dhuhr with Asr and Maghrib with Isha. It doesn't cross over to Asr and Maghrib, and it doesn't cross over to Isha and Fajr. No. So in the case where the person, they employ an excuse or a religious facility, then they won't be sinful because they're still following what Allah ordered. They're still following what Allah accepts and made permissible. So any questions about that before we move on? This is going to be a different case that we move on to. Right. So we explained that the person has to do the prayers within the time. So what happens if something happens to the person that makes him ineligible to pray? So now this is what the author is going to talk about here. He says, if an inhibited matter, which prevents the prayer from being an obligation on a person, such as menses, postpartum bleeding, insanity, or fainting, occurs after sufficient time to only perform the prayer has passed since the setting in of the prayer time, then they must make up that missed prayer, provided that they have the latitude religiously to perform purification before the setting in of the prayer's time. So let's break this case down with more detail. If a woman gets her period, she can no longer pray. This is the basic judgment. When a woman gets her period, she can no longer pray. And usually the case is normally that most of us, we're allowed, we're physically able to make wudu even before the prayer time is in. So let's say it's an hour before Dhuhr, and you made wudu, and you didn't do anything that invalidates the wudu until Dhuhr came in. So Dhuhr is in, and you still have your wudu from an hour ago. You can go ahead and pray Dhuhr. You don't have to wait until Dhuhr comes in to then make wudu so that you can pray Dhuhr. Normally the case is that most people, in the normal, according to the norm, they can make wudu beforehand. And they can pray with that wudu after the prayer time is in. They don't have to wait until the prayer time is in to then make purification to pray. So let's say that that's the case. We're going according to the normal case. Let's say a woman, the Dhuhr prayer came in, and half an hour passed. We're not obligated to, as soon as the prayer time is in, we're not obligated to rush to pray. We have this window of time. We can do it as soon as the prayer time is in, which is the best, and that's the ideal. Or we can wait 15 minutes or half an hour, as long as we do it within the prayer time. So this woman, the prayer time came in, and she waited half an hour before going to pray. When she went to go pray, after half an hour has passed, she realized that she got her period. She got her period. So what happens now? She can't pray, because while the woman is on her period, she's not allowed to pray. It wouldn't be valid, and it's not permissible. So what happens now to that prayer? When she gets off of her period, does she have to make sure that she makes that prayer up or not? This is the case that we're talking about. So what's the answer? The answer is, if enough time passed from the prayer time starting, that was enough for her to do the minimum valid amount of the prayer, then she does have to make that prayer up when her period is over. Because why? Why do we take into consideration only the minimum amount? Because she is, in the normal case, she can make wudu before the prayer time is in. She doesn't have to wait until the prayer time is in to make wudu so that she can pray. So in this case, how do we know if she has to make it up or not? She checks. How much time passed since the prayer time was in until I got my period? Was that enough time for me to do the minimum valid amount of the prayer? If the answer is yes, then when her period is over, she has to make it up. If the answer is no, when her period is over, she doesn't have to make it up. Is that case clear? Alhamdulillah. Now the reason that the scholars mention the menses is because this is the most common. This is the most common that usually happens. But that's not the only thing where this case, for example, would apply. Another example is postpartum bleeding. Nifas, which is after the woman gives birth, then she starts to bleed. Once that happens, she can no longer pray. Another example is insanity. So let's say that Dhuhr came in, half an hour passed, and this person then lost their mind. They became insane. When they regain their mind, if they do, then they check, was this enough time for me to do the minimum valid amount of the prayer or not? If the answer is yes, then when they regain their mind, they have to make it up. If the answer is no, then they don't have to make it up. Now the reason I'm saying half an hour is because that's way more than enough time to do the prayer. It's a very short time to do the minimum amount of the valid prayer. Now we're going to move on to the case where now her period is over. Okay, so this is a different case. The author said, or if an inhibitive matter occurs after sufficient time to perform the prayer and its purification has passed, given the person is not permitted to perform purification before the setting in of the prayer's time, like the case of the one afflicted with a matter such as incontinence of urine or istihaba, footnote, for the woman to discharge blood outside the normal period, then one also must make up that missed prayer when the inhibitive matter terminates. So this case is still the same one that we were explaining before, but with an extra detail. I thought that it was moving on to the other case, but it's still in the same case. So in this same case, now we're going to go on to the same case, but with an extra detail. What's the extra detail? The extra detail is some people, they have a sickness, a physical sickness. It's not something that any of us would want to happen, and we ask Allah that we are saved and protected from such a thing. But sometimes it happens that a person would have a physical sickness that causes them to constantly drip urine. So urine is constantly dripping out of them. It doesn't stop. This is called incontinence of urine. So what does this person do? This person, they still have to pray, but the process that they would have to do in order for them to do a valid prayer is different than someone who doesn't have that sickness. So like we mentioned before, us normally, we can make wudu before the prayer time is in, and then once the prayer time is in, we can pray. But this person who has incontinence of urine, they can't do that. So part of their process is that they have to wait until they're sure the prayer time is in, and then they do a certain process by which they lighten the amount of urine that's coming out of them, and then they do something like the wudu with a certain intention, and they do the actions of wudu with a specific intention, and then immediately after, they start the prayer. They can't delay and wait and relax and sit down on the couch and 10 minutes later pray the wudu. This process, they have to do it back to back, and then once they've completed it, they do the prayer. So for this person, we just add that if the inhibitive matter occurs after a time has passed that was enough for them to do the purification and the prayer, then when that inhibitive matter ends, they have to make it up. So the extra detail here is the amount of time. So let's say that this person has incontinence of urine, and in order for them to pray, they have to make wudu, or they have to do this process, and they have to then do the wudu, and then they do the prayer. So when their period happens, or whenever, if they go insane or if they faint, when that happens, they check. Did enough time pass for me to do the purification process and the prayer, or not? If the answer is yes, then when that inhibitive matter ends, they have to make it up. If the answer is no, they don't have to make it up. So the extra detail here is just adding a little bit more time. Any questions about that before we move on to when the inhibitive matter ends? No. So if the inhibitive matter, which prevents the prayer from being an obligation, ends, and there was enough time left of the prayer to say Allahu Akbar, or more than that, not less, one is obligated, that is liable, to make up this prayer and the prayer before it if they are combinable in the case of an excuse. That is, if it is permissible to combine the previous prayer with the current prayer during which the inhibitive matter ended for an excuse such as traveling. So this case now, this is the other side of the case. The woman, she got her period, let's say, half an hour after Dhuhr came in. Does she have to make it up? Yes, when her period is over, she has to make up that prayer that happened when her period started, that she missed when her period started. And she's not sinful for that. Now we're fast forwarding to when her period is over. So what happens when her period is over? When her period is over, she checks. The time that I'm in, is it a prayer time? Because it's possible that her period stopped after Fajr. In between Fajr and Dhuhr, is there a prayer? Is there an obligatory prayer between Fajr and Dhuhr? No. So if her period stopped, let's say like at 10 in the morning, Khalas, all she has to do, she makes her ghusl, and she makes up that prayer from when her period started, and she continues on her day. She prays Dhuhr when it comes in, she prays Asr when it comes in, etc. But what if her period stopped during her prayer time? So here she has to check. How much time is left of the prayer? If there's enough time for her to say, Allahu Akbar, just those two words, Allahu Akbar, then she knows that that prayer time she's in, once her period's over and she does her ghusl, she has to pray that prayer. And if it was the case that that prayer was combinable due to an excuse like traveling, then she has to pray the prayer before that as well. So what's the example that they give? Hence, it is an obligation to pray both the late afternoon, Asr, and early afternoon prayers, Dhuhr, because they are combined together for an excuse if the inhibitive matters such as menses or others ended and there was enough time to say Allahu Akbar before sunset. So this is one scenario. It's, let's say, 1 minute before Asr is over. She's still on her period. Then all of a sudden she realizes that her period's over. She stopped bleeding. How much time is left before Asr is over? 30 seconds. Is that enough time for her to say Allahu Akbar? Yes. So what does she have to do? She has to make up Asr, and she has to pray Asr, and she has to pray Dhuhr. Because Dhuhr and Asr, they are combinable for an excuse like traveling. Likewise, it is an obligation to pray both the nightfall, Isha, and sunset prayers, Maghrib, because they are combined together when there is an excuse, if there was enough time left to say Allahu Akbar before dawn. That is, provided the inhibitive matter ended before dawn by the duration it takes a person to say Allahu Akbar or more, not less. So basically what they're saying is, even if it was a short time, let's say 30 seconds before Isha was over, 30 seconds before Fajr came in, her period stopped. That's enough time for her to say Allahu Akbar, correct? Yes, it takes like 2 seconds to say Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar. Even less than 2 seconds. So 30 seconds is enough time for her to say Allahu Akbar. So now she knows the judgment is she has to pray Isha and she has to pray Maghrib. But in 30 seconds, is she going to be able to make ghusl and pray Isha before it's out? No. But still, the case is that she prays Isha. It just means that she won't be sinful for Isha going out while she's in the process of purifying herself so that she can pray. So even though the scholars, they say enough time for her to say Allahu Akbar, it doesn't mean that she has to do Isha before those 30 seconds are up, because that's impossible. So any questions about that before moving on? طيب, alhamdulillah. Page 65, section 6. The religious obligations upon the child's guardian. It is obligatory as a communal obligation on the guardian of both male and female children who are mumayyiz, that is, the child who has the capacity to reason and discern and understands when addressed and responds adequately, to order them to pray, even the make-up prayer, in a serious manner, indicating to the child the prayer's importance. So this is the first judgment. It is obligatory as a communal obligation. What does that mean? That means that it's not specific to an individual. Rather, it's a communal obligation upon the guardian. The guardian, like the mother, the father, the grandmother, the grandfather, etc. So one of them has to order this child who is mumayyiz and reach the age of 7 lunar years to pray. Now, what is mumayyiz? This term, mumayyiz, it means the child who has the capacity to reason and discern, which means and understands when addressed and responds adequately. This is the definition of mumayyiz. So, how can you tell? You ask the child questions that it requires for them to understand your question for them to answer. It wouldn't require for them to parrot an answer based on the question. So the scholars, they mention things like For example, how many times a year does Ramadan happen? And the child would understand that Ramadan is the month, the 9th month, and there's only one Ramadan each year, so the child would say once, for example. Or any other questions that you can ask the child that they would answer based on understanding the question. So you can ask the child things like, for example, what's your favorite subject in school? And the child said, my favorite subject in school is language arts. And so you ask the child, why is language arts your favorite subject? And the child would say, because I like poems, because I like reading stories, because I like reading books, for example. This means what? The child understands what you're saying and they're responding adequately. If you ask the child, what is your favorite subject in school? And they say, pancakes. Then you know that they're not understanding what you say. Then you know that they have no idea what you're saying. So they're not mumayyiz. So if the case is that they are mumayyiz, and they are 7 lunar years of age, it's a communal obligation upon the guardians to order that child to pray in a serious manner that indicates to the child the importance of the prayer. Okay? So, and this is at a very young age, Allahu Akbar. Some adults, they still don't know how to pray. They still don't know how to make wudu and pray and recite al-Fatiha. We're talking about a 7-year-old that has the ability to understand. From that age, the parent, the guardian, is obligated communally to order the child to pray. And to teach them the rules pertaining to it after they turn 7 lunar years old. However, if the child becomes mumayyiz before completing 7 lunar years, it is not an obligation to order the child to pray. But it's good to get them started. Because some children, they have been blessed with strong minds. So if somebody's blessed with a strong mind, that means that they'll become mumayyiz, they'll become mentally discriminant before 7 lunar years of age, like 6 and maybe even 5. If that's the case, if the child becomes mumayyiz before he's 7 lunar years of age, now you can train the child and teach them, but you're not obligated to. You won't be obligated to order the child to pray until he turns 7 lunar years of age, along with being mumayyiz. If the child is not mumayyiz and he is 7 lunar years of age, you're not obligated to order him because they're not mumayyiz, therefore their prayer won't be valid. And, the author said, it is an obligation to hit them, not in an abusive way that causes harm, for neglecting the prayer after completing 10 lunar years. So, now, because this is what the Prophet ﷺ said. He said to order the children to pray when they're 7 lunar years of age, and discipline them for not praying at 10 lunar years of age. Even though it's not an obligation upon the child, still at this age, they're 10 lunar years, if they haven't had any of the signs of pubescence, they're still not pubescent, they're not obligated themselves to pray. However, the guardian is obligated communally to discipline them. The literal words of the Prophet ﷺ is وَضْرِبُوهُمْ if they reach 10 lunar years of age, if they did not pray. Now this does not mean any disciplining through hitting does not equate to abuse. It does not necessitate abuse. Because the function of disciplining the child through hitting so that if they leave out the prayer, of course, number one, we're doing it because this is what the Prophet ﷺ said and we follow him. But the function of it is to show the child the severity of leaving out the prayer, so that they can learn early on that leaving out the prayer is not something easy, it's not something light, it's not something that you can just do and go on about your life. Because the scholars have mentioned the Muslim, the accountable Muslim, who leaves out the prayer out of laziness, he is damned. He is damned. damnation descends upon him constantly. It's a very dangerous situation. The person is very close to leaving out al-Islam. And that's according to the majority of the Sunni scholars, even though there's a valid minority among the Sunni scholars that said the Muslim, the accountable Muslim, who prays out of laziness, who doesn't pray out of laziness, who leaves out the prayer out of laziness, exits from Islam. Subhanallah. So there's a difference of opinion, a valid difference of opinion amongst the Sunni scholars about the Muslim, the accountable Muslim, who does not pray out of laziness. So it's a serious thing. Now what does that mean? That means it's a serious thing. So this hitting, this discipline that occurs, that the guardian is obligated to do, it is with the condition that this disciplining, it yields the desired result. It's with the condition that this hitting causes the child to then do the prayer. If the child is insubordinate to the extent that if you discipline them or not, they're still not going to listen, then you're not allowed to hit. But in the case that you're allowed to hit, it has to be also a condition. It has to be that it cannot be in an abusive way. It cannot be in an abusive way. You can't break his bones. You can't give them a black eye. You can't cause them to become handicapped. You can't hit them in a way that now they have an immobile arm. You can't destroy their organs. You can't maim them. You can't cause them to bleed. You can't bruise them. SubhanAllah. Some parents, na'udhu billah, they abuse their children. They physically abuse them. Some of them, they burn them. Some of them, they deprive them of food and drink. Some of them, they kick them. Some of them, they kick them really hard. Not just, we're not talking about, even though kicking, I've never heard kicking being a way of disciplining, but, and slapping them on the face, Islamically, it is not permissible to even slap a donkey in the face. Subhanallah. So how about your own child? Subhanallah. Some parents, they have an issue, an internal issue, and they have resentment and they have anger and they have unresolved trauma from when they were children, and they, for example, don't know how to cope with the stress of life or the stress of being a parent, and they project that onto the child. And they take it out on the child. Subhanallah. This child did not choose to be born. This child did not ask to be born. This child is a trust in your hands. This child is to be cared for and protected. This child is to be treated in a way to make them the best human being that they can be. They're not to be treated in a way to use as a punching bag. They're not to be treated in a way for them to be the one you take out your frustration and anger on. They're not to be treated in a way to be damaged. Subhanallah. This is a sickness, and may Allah protect us, and may Allah make the situation easy of the children that are being abused. No type of abuse is condoned in Islam. No. If he's 10 or more. And the point is for them to do the prayer. So let's say you told them to pray, for example, and they went, and you assume that they prayed, and then later you found out for sure that they didn't pray. Now this is where that discipline will take place. For example. And the point is to get them to pray. Any questions about that? The author said, the same is done in the case of fasting if the child can bear it. That is, the guardian is obligated to order the child to fast at 7 and hit them for not fasting while able at 10. However, if the child cannot bear fasting, then they are not ordered to do so. What does it mean the child cannot bear fasting? It means not physically able. Some children, their bodies are weak, subhanAllah. And if they were to fast, it would cause them actual harm. This child is not able to fast, so you don't force him, because he's not able. Even the grown adult who's not able, he's excused from fasting. So same thing applies to the child. Now, on the other side, some children, they have been, and this is the other spectrum. Some children, they're not abused by their parents in the sense that their parents physically hurt them and harm them and deprive them of food and treat them like trash. Some parents, they're at the other extreme, where they spoil, or they quote-unquote spoil or corrupt the child by treating the child in a way that doesn't teach the child the proper boundaries for living within life. Because not everybody is going to treat the child like the parent is. So the child has to understand that life goes a certain way, and there's certain things that you're allowed to do, certain things that you're not allowed to do. As you get older, there's certain ways of doing things that if you don't do them that way, you would be violating somebody else's rights. Some parents, they don't understand this concept, and they let their child dictate them. So whatever the child says, whatever the child screams, whatever the child orders, the parent does it. And this is wrong. This is not the proper way, because the parent is the authority figure. The parent is the one who is supposed to steer the child. The child is not the one that's supposed to steer the parent. So in this case, we have a child who they're used to getting everything that they want. And this is very dangerous. This is a highly dangerous thing. Why? Because if the child is used to at a young age to get everything that they want, then the moment that they can't get even a little thing that they want, they would do something destructive. They would do something negative. They would act in a way that's not proper. And this is why, and part of it is because the child was not taught that you don't get everything that you want. You can have what is halal, but even within the halal, you can't always get everything halal that you want, because life just doesn't work that way. So if the child, he's used to fulfilling every desire that he wants, he can eat whatever he wants and as much as he wants, and anything that he tells his parents, buy me this, buy me that, the parent does it. When it's time to tell the child to fast, this child is used to having the sugar and the candy and the sweets and whatever else that he wants and the so-called fast food from morning to night. So when you tell him it's time to fast, what's going to happen? He's going to feel the shock of not fulfilling every desire that he has. And he might say, no, I don't want to fast. I'm hungry. But is that enough to consider that the child can't bear fasting? If they say, I'm really hungry, I'm really thirsty. No, be patient. Be patient. You're not going to die if you don't eat or drink for, let's say, 8 hours. You're not going to die, for sure. It takes about 3 days of at least no water before you die. So you can last 8 hours. So if the child whines and complains, that doesn't mean that they can't bear fasting. It just means that they need to be patient. Page 66. It is also an obligation on the guardian to teach the mumayyiz children, males and females, the fundamental and essential matters of the belief, such as the existence of Allah, His oneness, that He does not resemble His creation, and that He is not a body. The guardian teaches the child that Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, may Allah raise his rank, is the messenger of Allah, that he was truthful in all that he had conveyed from Allah, that he was the last of the prophets, and that he received Al-Quran from Allah. They also must teach them that Allah created angels and that He will annihilate the earth and what is on it, and that He has created for the obedient people a place of residence in which they live in enjoyment called Al-Jannah, paradise. And for the Kafirs, the non-Muslims, a place of residence in which they live in torment, in torture, called An-Nar, hell, etc. And the guardian must also teach the Mumayyiz child the rules of the religion. That is, this is an obligation, such as the 5 prayers and fasting in Ramadan, and this is unlawful, forbidden, haram, like stealing, lying, even while joking, fornication, sodomy, gossip, and talebearing. And to teach them that using the siwak and the congregational prayers are religiously encouraged, and other similar matters. Allahu Akbar. We see the importance of teaching our children from an early age the basic rules of Islam. So we don't, claiming that we want to protect the children, we don't keep them ignorant of these judgments. We don't keep them ignorant about the prohibition of stealing. We don't keep them ignorant about the prohibition of lying, even while joking. We don't keep them ignorant about the prohibition of fornication. Yes, fornication. Yes, that 3-letter word that most parents, when they think about it and they think about telling their children, they get this misplaced fear. Misplaced fear. Because guess what? What do you think your children are watching on the Netflix? What do you think your children are watching on the YouTube? Even the cartoons, وَالْعِيَاذُ بِاللَّهِ, are introducing the wicked, perverted sexual things to the children. So if you don't teach your child before the Kafirs teach your child might think that this is normal, that the wicked, perverted sexual things are normal. And then as they get older, if this issue is not addressed, it might escalate to them being influenced by it. Because they see everybody around them doing this. They see that it's painted in a praised way. They see that this celebrity and that celebrity, they're doing this perverted thing. And they are an impressionable child, and they are easily influenced by these things, by trends and by celebrities and by the herd mentality, by what's supposedly popular. So the child, if they get to a point where now they're learning after they've already been exposed to all these things, and now they learn that this is wrong, they might be conflicted. They might feel within themselves like, I've been exposed already to these perverted things, and this is what I have known to be supposedly normal and accepted by everybody around me. Now I'm finding out that in my religion, this is unequivocally condemned and opposed. They might be conflicted, subhanAllah. They might think about their supposed friend or the person that they know from school or from the internet that is openly homosexual or is openly fornicating. Subhanallah. And they might think, oh, that means now that person that I've had private conversations with, that person that is supposedly been there for me, that person that I have this bond with, they're bad, they're evil, they're perverted, though they might be conflicted. Where in the first place, when you teach the child that some of these things, some things that people do, these things are forbidden, these things are bad, these things are negative, these things are toxic, these things are not good, these things are dirty, then the child will understand that there's some people that do these things, and if they ever encounter one of them, they would already know that this person is doing something that is bad. I don't do that, I'm not with that, I don't condone that, I don't encourage that, but they can still carry somewhat of an interaction with that person without them compromising or losing any of their religious values. So we do not keep our children ignorant about the religious judgments. This is very dangerous. The non-Muslims, they are not shy and they are not ashamed to do dirty, perverted things in the open and in public, and to promote it and to show it on TV and to try to shove it down people's throats and put it in people's faces. They're not afraid of that, they're not ashamed of that. So why would we be supposedly afraid or ashamed or shy from teaching our children what the Prophet ﷺ conveyed to us from our Creator? Why? We should not. We should not. Now, of course, when you're going to teach the child, you teach them in a way that the child understands. You teach them the amount that is suitable for the child, the amount that lets the child know what it is. You don't leave the child with a false image. You tell the child there's this thing called fornication, and that's when a man, for example, he puts his private part in the private part of the woman without being married. And this is haram. In Islam, this act, the act of sexual intercourse, is through marriage. If somebody wants to do that, they get married. And they can do that. But before getting married, they cannot do that. This is bad, this is haram. It is ugly and it is not good. Now, yes. Yes, I noticed that. Yes. 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 Yes, so the sister is mentioning that there has been a certain desensitization that has occurred for this younger generation concerning the matters that are Islamically prohibited in terms of sexual contact. So there's a certain types of sexual contact that are forbidden in Islam. Like, for example, for two people of the same gender to have sexual contact, this is forbidden. And in the past, like the sister was saying, like her generation, it was something that automatically the Muslim who was educated, he would have an immediate any shock or repulsion taken aback by someone, let's say, openly admitting that or openly saying that. And she was saying that nowadays, many young Muslims, when they hear about someone that is openly doing that or openly admitting that about themselves, they don't have that same initial repulsion or initial shock. It's as if they have been desensitized to the fact that this is something that's occurring among people, to the point where they don't have that initial repulsion or rejection. That doesn't necessitate that they accept it and that they think it's okay, because they know the judgment. If they're educated, they know the judgment, and they don't want to compromise their religion, but they don't have the same reaction. And subhanAllah, that the reason for that reaction is because there has been a big level of desensitization for these matters. So, not to get on the subject too much, but basically in Islam, there's certain sexual contact that's not allowed. There's different types, whether it was with the same gender or with the opposite gender. So among men and women, there's a certain sexual contact that's not allowed. For example, if a man and a woman, they're not married, then they cannot have sexual contact. They cannot have sexual contact. They can, let's say, talk to each other with words that are not sexual or that arouse the desire, etc. They can have a platonic conversation. This is permissible. But if they have those desires, those sexual desires towards each other, they can fulfill them through marriage and not without marriage. And not without marriage or something like marriage. And for members of the same gender, there's no sexual contact allowed under any circumstance. For members of the same gender, Islamically, there is no sexual contact allowed at all. So, and it's important to understand this point, the Islamic perspective, which is that Islamically, we don't say that a man can't, for example, love another man, because the companions, they loved each other. And we're obligated to love the Prophet ﷺ above all creations. So love does not equal to sexual contact. And this is the part that the people who push that agenda, that they don't understand. That just because you, let's say, love someone, that doesn't mean that you have to have sexual contact with them. Just because, let's say, you like someone for their good qualities or whatever, or for example, they are a beautiful person, that doesn't necessitate having sexual contact with them. So if a person, they have sexual desires towards a member of the same gender, as a Muslim, what they have to do is not act on those sexual desires. Just like, similar to, if there's a Muslim who has a sexual desire for a member of the opposite gender, they cannot act on those sexual desires, for example, without marriage. So the same way, and then sometimes there's people that you can, let's say, hypothetically marry, but they're already married, for example. So at the moment, as it stands in the reality, you can't marry them. So you can't fulfill the sexual desires with that person because, for example, they're already married. So this is an example of just being patient upon an inclination that you cannot act on. So if there was a Muslim who had sexual desires for a member of the same gender, they just have to discipline themselves and be patient on that desire and not act on it. That's the Islamic perspective. And we'll stop here for today. There are no questions. And also, to make it clear, the Islamic perspective is, if someone acts on those sinful desires, then they're sinful. And they're sinful. And we know the case of the Muslim who commits sins is that if they die without repenting from those sins, then there's a possibility that they'll be forgiven, and there's a possibility that they will be punished in hell for it. But in all cases, if the Muslim, if he is punished in hell, he doesn't remain there forever and ever. So, and it's important to understand that the Islamic perspective, that a sin is a sin, regardless of, for example, if in society, for example, it's become trendy or popular or somewhat normalized. The Muslim, he understands what the rules are, and he strives to obey Allah as much as he can. Barakallahu feekum. Are there any questions? No. Yeah, so that goes back to the rule that we mentioned, which is that if the non-abusive hitting, if that doesn't get you the desired result, then you're not allowed to do it. So you can do something else, for example, that's not abusive to get them to pray. Yeah. And in whatever permissible way that you can force them physically to do it, then you're allowed to do that. And if by doing that, by disciplining them that way, it would make them pray. Any others? طيب نهدد لا إله إلا الله اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم رب اغفر لي وللمؤمنين والمؤمنات